Okay, that's a good way to start. All right. Thanks, James. Guys, I am super excited to host this. Is this too loud?
No, you're
good. All right. I am legitimately excited that you guys got to come here, and this is a wonderful crowd of people that I love dearly. So it's going to be a fun night because I've enjoyed tutoring over the past 5 trimesters, and during that time I found it was always like a struggle to not teach things that weren't going to be on the test just because I thought it was cool. Because after a while of tutoring DAA, when I started throwing in fun facts that weren't on the test, people would be like, can you just teach what's on the test, please, because I want to pass. So that's kind of Parker culture, and that's fine. So we decided to kind of separate this out and do this fun new thing of this is the human body from a perspective that is not going to be on your test, but it's something that's going to be in life for the rest of your life. This is kind of a viewpoint that you guys are going to be using in practice every single day. And it's kind of a skill almost, how to look at the human body as a whole. It's not something that you pick up sitting in a class studying one subject at a time and never connecting them. Because there's so much more to it than just each individual slice that we memorize the heck out of, pass the test, and then drop. It's something that needs to be integrated. And that's why we're calling this the integrated session, and something that hopefully we can get started as a way of thinking for the student culture here on campus. Cool? So it started off by me I was in the board reviews and in Try 5, and I was just amazed by how many people of my classmates never connected the dots between their classes, because board reviews is all about taking everything you learned from tries 1 through 4 and mashing it all up into something that you can regurgitate on a giant exam, which is painful, but at the same time, it's amazing because it's the first time we cover everything about the human body that we had learned up to that point in a very short amount of time. And people, whether they wanted to or not, started to connect the dots about like, oh my gosh, the heart physiology and the heart biochemistry go hand in hand, and if you learn one, you know the other. And it's just kind of this magical network of systems that intertwine and relate to one another in such a way that all ties back to the profession that we're going into. Something that we can actually impact, something that we can actually do. So I started thinking about like what our best asset is at this school, because I hear a lot of complaining, which is fine. Every school has its complaining, but at the same time, we never take a moment to look at what our best asset is. And in my opinion, our best asset right now is the worldview that we have towards the human body. That is, we look at the body as an art, a science, and a philosophy. We say it's the art, science, and philosophy of chiropractic, but the chiropractic worldview on the body combines all those aspects into a worldview of health and wellness that is not just science of the brain, not just science of the nervous system. It's the science of the entire system as a whole. So that's something that, whether you want to or not, you get the opportunity to start looking at as you take these classes. The only problem is we have the amazing teachers that we do who are masters in their field, but not necessarily masters in all the other fields here taught at Parker. So the job to connect the dots is on us. And we can't necessarily expect a genius biochemist to connect the dots back to chiropractic, because that's not necessarily his job. His or her, whoever that might be. Perfect teacher. But does that make sense? So it's super cool when you get to board reviews, I thought, because you get to start just for fun. Like, I got to sit down with a book and study the human body wherever I wanted to go, and no matter what I studied, it was probably going to be on boards. So it was just kind of this beautiful thing of like, let's figure out how this system works. Let's actually figure out how this can be impacted by chiropractic. Let's figure out how this can go wrong pathologically. So that's where these sessions are started coming from. We're going to start putting them together for the DXI people. We've already had a couple done by Leslie from our DXI team. And then we're going to start doing these breakout sessions, which aren't connected with the class, so that we can start talking about things as a whole. Sound good? So as you guys, I think going through the program, one good asset that you have is to start thinking of your best asset. That is to look at everything as a whole, like the anatomy, the physiology, the cells and tissues aspect of it, that's the stuff that makes up our anatomy, and then the biochemistry, that stuff that makes up, or not the stuff, the processes that fuel the cells and tissues that make up the anatomy. So it's just one big stream of information that from start to finish is 100% coherent. So right now, yeah, this is actually a poster that I have hanging on my wall because I don't have friends, I guess, and it's like it's probably 8 feet tall, and it covers my wall. This is all the biochemical pathways that we have mapped out in the body, most of them anyways. And the longer you look at it, the more you realize that everything in the body is completely dependent on every other pathway. Like we learned glycolysis as one pathway, but if you look at it right here, you notice it's not just one stream of things happening. It's one stream of things happening that's directly influenced by so many other things going on in the body. And while I was coming up with this session, trying to find like, this matters in this way and this connects to this, trying to come up with some coherent connection between the classes, I just was kind of amazed by how immensely complex that this topic is. And it's something that we can't cover in one session. And it's not something we can cover in one degree. Because there's so much complexity that goes into every single thing our body does to manage life. Every biochemical pathway and every physiological pathway, and the millions of pathways that there are, and the 100 trillion cells that go into making us work, that's not something that we can just simplify. And it's not something I feel like we should be satisfied simplifying. So that's why we should try and start this culture of integration, where we try and like just connect the dots, understand the processes, and go from there and become the masters of our field, where we are respected as people who have a legitimate worldview on the human body. But we can't do that unless we understand what's actually happening. So the education side of it is very important. Your worldview is very important because it has the ability to heal people. And it's okay to have a worldview and have no understanding to substantiate it. There's a lot of doctors out there who, after they graduate, they stop learning. And they're chiropractors, and they adjust, and they still get good results with their patients. They still heal a lot of people. But the masters in this field need to be the groundbreakers that take us to the next level and understand exactly what we're doing every single day. Cool? So one of the pillars of chiropractic philosophy is the master system of the body is the nervous system. So I wanted to start with something how the nervous system is controlling everything. Because it does, and it always will, and that's why chiropractic works so well. So that's where I want to start today. And I wanted to start with a subject that we all relate to and that we all hear a lot about, but we don't hear always about it in the grander scheme at our education level, and that's stress, right? So here, have you guys been stressed recently? All these try-3s, I think try 3, 5, and 7 all have a DXI test this week, either tomorrow or Friday. So we're all looking forward to that. 4, not 5, sorry. Including me. So screw that. Just kidding. DXI is very important. Just kidding. No, I wasn't just kidding. Huh? Yeah, screw the stress. So let's talk about the stress of the nervous system, which is a nervous system-oriented response to stimuli, and how that can affect every layer of the body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down, and I'm going to try and explain it at a couple different levels because there's people across different trimesters here. So see which level that you can identify it at, and also see which classes that you're learning these in and how you can start to say, oh, we learned that in this class, and this dot's being connected over here. Let's see what other dots you can connect. Because like I said, this is so complicated. I've had to simplify some things past where I'm comfortable simply because it's so much more complicated than I understand. Cool? I like to start with neurology because neurology is one of my favorite subjects. This is Dr. Marsban's one of his drawings that you get to look forward to that will make absolutely no sense after you're done with the lecture. You leave and then you look back at your notes and like, I have no clue what's going on. But in neurology, I just want to start with a couple basics. So you've got a couple different parts to your brain, and each part of your brain kind of serves a different, it's like a different color in a painting, where it serves a very distinct purpose to send a very distinct message. And they each they have different controls over different systems. So we have a frontal lobe of our brain, which the frontal lobe is the part of you that makes you distinctly you. Your frontal lobe, it gives you your personality, it gives you your ability to critically think, and it gives you your power to reason, and it gives you all the things that make you a rational, well-rounded thinking human being. And the primary thing that fuels that frontal lobe is sensory input. So every input that we get is integrated by the frontal lobe. It's taken in and it's processed by that frontal lobe. So kind of the shorthand way of saying that is like you are made by your experiences. You're driven by your sensory input. Without the sensory input, they've actually done studies where if you deprive someone of sensory input, they will go crazy because the part of them that makes them rational and logically thinking will not be fueled. It will eventually wither away and die because we have all the sensory information that keeps us going, that keeps us alive. Okay, so that's fact number one that we're going to accept for the moment. The next one is the frontal lobe is in control of your limbic system. So you've got another part of the brain called the limbic system, and that limbic system is responsible for your emotions, and it's responsible for your emotional response to stimuli. So if you have a frontal lobe that doesn't have very good control of your limbic system, you're going to be very emotional all the time, and meaningless stimuli will elicit an emotional response. Make sense? Because the frontal lobe doesn't regulate how that stimuli goes into the limbic system and how it responds to it. Okay? So fact number one, sensory input fuels the frontal lobe. Fact number two, the frontal lobe controls the limbic system. It controls your emotion. Fact number three, the limbic system is the mastermind of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of you that's responsible for keeping you alive in times of dire need. So if you're being chased, the typical example, if you're being chased by a tiger, you're going to trigger a limbic response. You're going to trigger an autonomic, sympathetic fight or flight response. So that means your limbic system, if it thinks that you're going to die, it's going to fire this systematic system of stress, and it's going to get you away from that situation as fast as possible, which is an amazing response and a very necessary reflex for life. Because we all have had times in life where we needed to react very quickly and our entire bodies needed to be acting in unison. So that's fact number three. Fact number one, sensory fuels the frontal lobe. Fact number two, frontal lobe controls the limbic system. And fact number three, the limbic system controls your autonomics. Okay? So your autonomic nervous system is hugely responsible for balancing health because you have two parts to it. You have the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, and you have the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. The balance of life is between your parasympathetic and sympathetic, whether you're running around fighting and flighting or you're eating and digesting and resting. Okay? And it's this balance that is extremely responsible for your health and wellness, and because how you get food, how you do all these things is well connected to the limbic system. And that limbic system is controlled by the frontal lobe, and that frontal lobe is controlled by his sensory input. Cool? Everybody fine with those four tenets so far? So to dive a little bit deeper into how the frontal lobe is integrated, it integrates the sensory information. We've got these two areas of your brain, the parietal or the PTO association area and Wernicke's area. Those are two separate areas of the brain, and those are the first places in the brain. They overlap a lot. They're two names. Kind of just think of them as the same thing. It doesn't matter. Okay? So this area in the brain, this little gray area, it receives all the sensory information to shuttle to the frontal lobe. Okay? It just receives it, and its job basically is to try and make sense of this information. And it takes things from your right side, it takes things from your left side, and it combines it all and tries to make a pretty picture to give to the frontal lobe, so that the frontal lobe doesn't get this combobulated jumble of mishmash sensory information. Okay? So it's Wernicke's PTO association area. It's its job to make sure the frontal lobe is getting the best sensory information possible. And if it can't do that, it's going to take over control of the limbic system and release a sympathetic response. Okay? So that's another tenet, I guess. And what happens is if you have, what's my next slide? Cool. So what happens if you have imbalance in your brain? Basically, if your right brain is stronger than your left brain, like say you're a really artsy person and you never exert yourself physically, and you sit in a room painting all day, doing very creative things, your brain's not going to be completely balanced because there's an entire portion of your brain dedicated to physical activity, and it needs that to stay alive. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a strong one side of your brain and a weak other side. And when that happens, the sensory information isn't going to be integrated quite properly because it's an imbalance in sensory input. So this Wernicke's area senses that imbalance, and it can't make a pretty picture to send to the frontal lobe. Does that make sense? So if you can't get a sensory information, if the Wernicke's area can't make sense of what's going on, it interprets that as that you're in danger. Because, and we all experience this, you walk up to someone, tap them on the shoulder, and they freak out, right? And that's because that Wernicke's area felt that stimulation, but it couldn't make sense of it. It didn't know why there was a tap on their shoulder. Some people have a much stronger sensory input, much more balanced with the more rational side of their brain, saying that's just a gentle tap, it's probably an innocent bystander, so there's no need to react. All that happens instantaneously. Some people have a little bit of an imbalance that leads to a sympathetic response to meaningless stimuli. And that's all because this Wernicke's area didn't receive balanced input to send to the frontal lobe. Cool? That's like awesome neurology stuff, and if you're caught up with that, you're golden. So basically, from start to finish, you get sensory input, it goes to Wernicke's area. If it can't make sense of it, it sends out a sympathetic response to try and respond to what it interprets as a bad situation. So I made this fun little chart, and then I realized it's completely meaningless to this session, but I wanted to leave it anyway because I put effort into it. So this is basically the chiropractic adjustment in a nutshell. Like, this is where all that sensory information goes. And it's actually really cool because all these areas in the brain get strengthened when you adjust somebody. Because stimulus equals strength. Stimulus keeps the brain alive. So that's just a fun fact. I didn't want to waste it, so there you go. Okay, so life is about balance. It's about keeping everything in the brain connected in a way that can get that sensory information to keep making sense. Cool? Otherwise, what results is a constant state of stress. Okay? So the sympathetic response, I'm just going to talk real briefly about what it naturally should be, and then we'll get into how it becomes abnormal and what those altercations mean. Okay? So there's 3 ways that the sympathetic nervous system expresses. One is is hormonally. So the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, it releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, and that acts on the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. You guys will all go over this sometime, but it's a pathway of hormones that eventually leads to the release of cortisol by the zona fasciculata of the kidneys. Okay? So the limbic system, which is in charge of emotions and sympathetic response, it releases a hormone. That hormone acts on the pituitary gland to release another hormone, and that hormone goes down to the kidney, and that tells the kidney to release cortisol. And cortisol is the stress hormone. Cortisol helps stimulate the body and get ready for a state of fight or flight. Okay, and we'll go into cortisol in a little bit. So that's the endocrine, the hormonal function of the sympathetic nervous system. There's another endocrine. There's 2 endocrine functions. The other one is T5 to T11 nerve roots. Those nerve roots go out and stimulate the adrenal medulla, and that releases the neurotransmitters epinephrine and norepinephrine straight into the blood, commonly known as adrenaline. And that adrenaline goes throughout the entire body, everywhere you have blood vessels, and it stimulates all your sympathetic receptors on all the cells needed for a sympathetic response. So you have, from head to toe, a sympathetic stress response in every single portion of your body. And the third way it does it is T1 to L2, sympathetic nervous system. Those where all the preganglionic neurons originate, and those can go out through the white rami communicantes, synapse with a postganglionic neuron, and then which will release norepinephrine and epinephrine at specific target tissues. So the difference is that number 2 here, that's going to release into the bloodstream all these neurotransmitters to generalize, just stimulate everything. But T1 to L2, those will specifically target specific target tissues, but for the same sympathetic stress response. Okay? So those are the three ways that it's done. And this is a picture of the first way. So basically you can see up here is the hippocampus and the amygdala, which those are 2 of the areas named for part of the limbic system. The limbic system is made up of a bunch of different nuclei in the brain, and these are 2 of them. Okay? And I should stop fidgeting. And when those things get that sympathetic response, they're going to fire off to the paraventricular nucleus to release the one hormone that releases the next hormone that eventually leads to the release of the glucocorticoids, which is cortisol. Okay? And then the 2 parts of the adrenal gland, you have the medulla and the cortex. The medulla releases norepinephrine and epinephrine when T5 to T11 stimulate it, and then the cortex releases 3 types of hormones, the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the androgens. And under stress, only the glucocorticoids are released by those 3 layers. And I'm sure you guys are all, and if you haven't gotten to this in Try 1 yet, you're going to get used to pictures like these about how the sympathetic nervous system can stimulate certain specific target tissues via the paravertebral chain. All right, so that's completely normal, and we all need a sympathetic response. But then there comes a chronic sympathetic response, which is what happens when you have a brain imbalance and when you have a lifestyle that doesn't let your brain balance. So people say, oh, I'm in a stressful job. What that means is that they're in a situation that doesn't let their brain rest. They're in a situation that doesn't let their brain normalize the normal daily activity. Any job is doable, no matter how stressful, if your brain has the time to integrate each sensory input. Does that make sense? So if we could have a CEO of a company, and if he works 7 days a week, full-time, and he's always about work, there's no time for his brain to actually become cognizant of what he's experiencing. And that's going to result in imbalance because the frontal lobe can't do that much information at once. It's not going to be able to keep up. So what happens is there's an imbalance and the body goes into survival mode. It's like, okay, now there's all this stimuli that I can't process. I need to release a sympathetic response, which if that happened once or twice would be totally normal. But people's lifestyles elicit chronic responses, and chronic responses are very bad. And we're going to go into a couple of things that they're bad in, but we're not made to have chronic sympathetic responses. It's only made to be a very short time period. So the first thing that we're going to do is to go back to biochem, because I know that's all of our favorite subjects. So, yeah, let's get excited about biochem, because legitimately if you don't understand biochem, you don't understand physiology. And if you want to understand the human body, you have to understand physiology. So you can't just skip an entire piece of the puzzle just because it was really hard. Okay? I thought it was hard too. So this isn't just me. I struggled with biochem and I worked through it, and now I understand that it's absolutely vital in understanding the human body. But the thing is, it's like super cool when you look at it in the big picture. Like biochem is rough when you look at it as when you're only studying biochem, because it doesn't seem to relate to anything and it doesn't seem connectable to chiropractic. But when you look at biochem through the window of trying to understand a process in the human body that's vital to chiropractic, it's the best thing in the world. Cool? All right, so we have this thing called the pyruvate to acetyl-CoA pathway. It converts the product of glycolysis into something that can enter the TCA cycle. Okay, we're all going to study it. If you haven't studied it yet, you will study it. And it's basically, it's because glycolysis is kind of a precursor to, like, it starts the breakdown of glucose into usable energy. And then the TCA cycle helps finish that off and converts it into something else that can be more converted into more energy, so the body can keep running, keep up the metabolic pathways. And all these metabolic pathways, if we're under a sympathetic response, they get boosted by cortisol. Cortisol, one thing that it does is it boosts these pathways, make them run much faster. And we need that because under a sympathetic response, we need more energy in each and every cell. So that cortisol in our blood goes and acts on all the cells so that they boost the glycolytic pathways, and they boost this pathway, the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, and then it boosts the TCA cycle. The downfall of that is that these cycles are nutritionally expensive at the for the sake of energy. Make sense? We need a good diet to keep these pathways alive. So in that, like things like B vitamins. So right now we're just going to talk about the B vitamins. We learned about the 5 things necessary to make the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex work, and that's basically TPP, which is vitamin B1, made it simply, lipo-8, which is, doesn't matter, FAD, which is vitamin B2, and then niacin, which is vitamin B3, which is NAD. And those 3 things, and there's vitamin B5, which isn't in this, and there's a couple other B vitamins that are used in the TCA cycle. A bunch of B vitamins used in the glycolytic pathways, okay? And what happens is if you keep boosting these higher than the resting potential, like, you know, have your resting membrane potential, like your resting metabolic rate, if you increase these past the metabolic rate for too long, you're going to run out of the nutrients necessary to keep these pathways going, okay? And if you run out of these nutrients, you're going to go into a hypoxic state. You're not going to be able to aerobically go through glycolysis anymore. And what happens in that instance is you have And there's some more B vitamins, the guys in pink. When you have a B vitamin deficiency, it blocks the TCA cycle because you can't convert pyruvate to acetyl-CoA anymore. You can't do it without the B vitamins. When that happens, you go into, when you work out, you get all the lactic acid buildup. That's in essence what happens because you don't have, and when you're working out, you can't get enough nutrients there fast enough, so it goes through the anaerobic cycle. And the anaerobic cycle converts this to lactic acid. It's the last-ditch effort to make energy out of the products that you have with what you have. It's not ideal because the result is a buildup of lactic acid. And guess what? In order to get lactic acid out, you need B vitamins. So it's kind of like a lose-lose situation because you keep making energy, but you can't get rid of the product, and the product hurts. So what happens is people get this chronic buildup of lactic acid in their muscles all over, and that's more commonly being seen and diagnosed as fibromyalgia. And I'm not saying, because I can't say stress is the cause of fibromyalgia, but it's a huge role in it. And it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And as chiropractors, we can totally say, you're too stressed. I think you should take a long weekend or something. Because we are going to see people that are way too stressed. And if you look at someone and say, oh, you have fibromyalgia, that's not my problem, because I don't know what that is or what's the pathways going on. Well, not that you would say that, but like, there's a lot of things going on in the medical world that we're not going to understand unless we actually actively go out there to try and understand them. And this is one of them. So stress deeply, deeply impacts the fibromyalgia patients, which is a big market right now. Okay? But that's not all. Okay. So another thing that you need B vitamins for, I'm harping on these because it's easy, but B vitamins are used in making serotonin and melatonin. You cannot make those two hormones without the B vitamins there to help convert tryptophan into the hormones, okay? So if you get rid of these B vitamins by running out via deficiency, you're going to have people that have fatigue, chronic fatigue. And this takes years to build up. Your body just eventually runs out of stuff. Chronic fatigue. You're going to have people who aren't sleeping because the melatonin's not working to regulate their sleep-wake cycle, okay? And then also what we have is cortisol is an active inhibitor of thyroid hormones at 2 levels. Cortisol comes down here and inhibits TSH, which thyroid-stimulating hormone is released by the pituitary gland, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to start releasing and making more thyroid hormone, which thyroid hormone establishes your body's entire metabolic rate. Okay? It inhibits TSH, so the thyroid gland never gets the message that it's supposed to be making thyroid hormone, and cortisol also actively inhibits the conversion of the hormones T4 to T3. So how the thyroid gland works is that you have all this iodine, and it combines it into this 4-ring structure. So there's 4 iodines in a T4. That's why it's called T4. And it's not very active. It's waiting until the body needs it, and then it's going to be activated to go out through the body and boost each cell's metabolic pathway. Okay? And the reason it's inhibited is because it's not the most efficient way of doing it under stress conditions because it's slow. So this is not the pathway the body wants to use while you're stressed. It's going to use the quick, easy cop-out pathways. Okay? So this way is going to be inhibited, so they're not trying to go at the same time. But anyway, cortisol is going to go inhibit the conversion of T4 to T3, which basically all that's happening is you're taking off an extra iodine to make the most potent form of thyroid hormone, which is T3, triiodothyronine. Okay? So when that can't happen, you're not going to have any active thyroid hormone in there. And this hormone is super important in when you're working out and when you're trying to lose weight, because without the active form of thyroid hormone T3, you're not going to be able to shed fat. It's not going to be metabolized. So people are going to come in your office like, I've been trying to lose weight for so long, it just won't go anywhere. And that's exactly this problem. The other thing is weight gain won't happen either, because without the proper, people who are trying to gain weight are also going to have problems because nothing's going to be metabolized properly once it gets in, because this pathway isn't working. So you're going to have both sides of the coin. People are going to come in complaining of the inability of their body to do what the body is innately supposed to do. And there's always a reason, and there's always a reason that you guys can find out. Okay? So we have a decreased metabolism, and we have factor-deficient glycolytic pathways, which means glycolysis isn't working, our metabolism isn't working, so might as well throw in some other things to make it even worse, right? So these conditions that we just talked about will lead to a rise in blood glucose because the glucose can't be broken down anymore. We're running out of ways to break down glucose. The lactic acid anaerobic pathway is not the best pathway, so it's not going to happen in as great a quantity as we need. We're going to run out of energy, and then the glucose is just going to be left in the blood with nowhere to go. To respond, the pancreas is going to release a lot of insulin, because insulin is responsible for telling the cells to take that glucose out of the blood to use it for energy. So basically, insulin binds the cell. The cell's like, okay, that must mean we need to take glucose and make it into energy, and they take it all out of the blood. So the pancreas pumps out all this extra insulin to try and take care of the high blood glucose. But that doesn't necessarily work because we just keep storing it in the blood, keep storing it in the blood. So chronically, the pancreas is going to keep releasing insulin into the blood. And we all know what happens when the pancreas wears out, and that's diabetes. People get diabetes when their pancreas can't function properly. You can also get diabetes when the receptors for insulin become immune to insulin. Basically, they've been barded so long with so much that they're like, I'm so over you. Like they don't really care about insulin anymore, and they stop responding, so the cells don't get that message to uptake glucose anymore. And that's because of overuse of these hormones. Okay? And what happens at that point is if you have a buildup in glucose in the blood, the hemoglobin starts to denature because glucose and hemoglobin don't get along too well. And we call that glycosylated hemoglobin. And you can see that in a blood test. And when you get glycosylated hemoglobin, you can't bind to oxygen as much as your body needs. And that's where you get peripheral neuropathy. Because the most distal parts of your body aren't getting the oxygen because the oxygen's already been used in the proximal tissues. So by the time the blood gets to your periphery, there's no oxygen left. And the most fragile part of your body is the nervous system, and it goes first. The rest of your tissue is dying from diabetes, but the first sign is the diabetic neuropathy from this glycosylated hemoglobin because of the increased blood glucose. Cool. All right, next. We've got all this sympathetic stimulation, and we always with the sympathetic response have parasympathetic downregulation. And this is kind of I drew this in Dr. Marsban's class, and I think it's a really good drawing of how it actually works because it shows you the upper neurons are sympathetic neurons, and the lower neurons are parasympathetic neurons. And you can see branches of this purple sympathetic neuron are actually actively inhibiting the parasympathetic neurons. And they're acting on, for those of you who know, the alpha-2 receptors located on the preganglionic parasympathetic nerve terminus, which are autoinhibitory to neurotransmitter release. So basically, the postganglionic sympathetic neuron goes down and it doesn't even let the parasympathetic reach the tissue. So it can't communicate with the tissue at all because the sympathetic is saying, hey, we're in control. We need all the body's energy right now. We're not going to let the body devote any energy to things that aren't necessary to a sympathetic response. Because it would be a complete waste of time if you're running away from the tiger and trying to digest a meal at the same time. Because you need all that energy, all that blood flow, all those nutrients to go out to your skeletal muscles. Okay? So if you have decreased parasympathetic nervous system, for a little while, that's fine, no problem. But after you have it for a chronic amount of time, all those essential functions that the parasympathetic nervous system does will stop happening. Things like your sphincter tone. That's actually more simple. Your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for keeping your sphincters tight so that you're not getting like esophageal reflux while you're running from a tiger. But if you just always keep your esophagus tight, it's going to get completely worn out. And it's not going to be able to be sustainable. And things like Barrett's esophagus, which is where you have a metaplasia, basically, where the tissue changes its type because the acid from your stomach is eroding at it. So it has to turn into a completely different tissue to sustain that wear and tear. That's bad. Okay? And then you get gastroesophageal reflux, and then you get ulcers. Like, these things are all, like, if you don't have parasympathetic nervous system, you're not producing the mucosa necessary to keep the acid from eroding away at the intestinal lining into the stomach lining. Because the mucosal layer, as you can see, this inner green circle in the picture, that's responsible for making all the mucus that lines your GI tract. And if you're not stimulating that layer, you're not making a protective sheath to protect against everything you're eating. And under chronic stress situations, people still eat. So you're still putting just as much food through that system, but you're putting food through a system that's inability to handle it, that's unable to handle it. So you're losing function. You're losing the tissue, and you're damaging pretty much your entire GI tract. Another thing that happens is if you have decreased parasympathetic stimulation, you have increased transit time of your food. So parasympathetic nervous system, it's what keeps everything, all your guts moving. It keeps the peristaltic waves pushing the food through the system to eventually out of your body. If you don't have that parasympathetic nervous system, you're going to basically stop moving. Everything's going to become real slow. The food's going to take a long time to get through your system, and people are going to, what happens is the food, all the water naturally, because the small intestine naturally just draws water out of your food. And if it's in there longer, more water is going to be drawn out. So a lot of people right now, that leads to constipation, because by the time the food gets to the rectum, it's very dry. It's very bolus, and it doesn't have the right consistency to work with the natural flow of the body. And what happens when people increase their abdominal pressure while trying to evacuate that constipation, outpouchings can form in the intestine like a bubble coming out of your tire, or an aneurysm of your tire of your car. And that's called diverticula, and they easily get infected, and that's called diverticulitis, which is a pretty common problem in the baby boomers right now. And irritable bowel syndrome is also another problem with the sphincter tone being affected and not working quite right in junction with the parasympathetic flow. Okay? So another thing is that your digestion is very hormonally regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and one thing that's drastically affected by the hormones is your gallbladder. So your gallbladder, it constricts when there's the presence of fatty food, but your body never senses that there's fatty food if the hormones aren't working properly and if the parasympathetic nervous system isn't completely alert. So you have a gallbladder that's sitting there waiting to digest fat, but it never gets the signal to release its stuff. So it never constricts, never releasing anything. So that leads to gallstones, because after a while that bile just kind of turns into little lifts. It turns into little stones, and that's painful. Cute but painful. Little happy gallbladder, look what it made. I don't even know what that means. So leaky gut. Leaky gut's one of those things that when I first came here, people have mixed feelings about it, just because some people don't believe it's a thing, some people believe it's a thing. It's hard to substantiate, but if you look at the anatomy and physiology of it, it makes a lot of sense. And it's very well substantiated in many, and I have some research articles that you guys can check out that completely validate it. So malabsorption caused by decreased parasympathetic, because think about it, if your guts aren't working right, you're not getting the right nutrients out of your food. It's not working with the food to try and efficiently regulate what's going into your bloodstream and effectively, eventually going into your body. So that's malabsorption. And that eventually, without the stimulation, is going to lead to a breakdown in intestinal epithelium. And those tight junctions that hold all the cells together are going to eventually disassociate. Okay? When those tight junctions disassociate, things are going to start, proteins and molecules from the blood, from the food, start leaking into your blood system. Those are things that were very highly regulated and kept out of the blood beforehand. Because your blood doesn't actually just take fat and put it into the bloodstream. It doesn't just take these proteins and put it in the blood. It regulates it, and it only puts it into the bloodstream once it's sufficiently broken down by the GI tract. Once it's at a safe level of digestion to be let into the blood. So what happens is these things get into the bloodstream and they start to wreak havoc on the immune system, because the immune system sees them as invaders. The immune system works in two ways. Well, not two ways. It's very black and white. It's either a normal tissue or it's an abnormal tissue, and it doesn't care what it is. If it's abnormal and doesn't belong there and it's not recognizable, it's going to cause an immune response, which is great for viruses and bacteria, because we don't want those in our blood. But things like casein in milk, that's a normal thing, but our body doesn't recognize it as self. It recognizes it as an invader. So we have these things leaking in, and that causes an immune response, And this is the tricky part. So you have a molecule from food, it leaks into the blood, you have an immune cell latch onto it and say, hey, this is bad. It goes back, makes all these antibodies against it, and then it attacks it. Now you have all these antibodies to something that's in essence harmless. Those antibodies also share a configuration with normal tissues in the body. That means that thing that leaked into your body had a similar shape to something else in your body that was a normal tissue. And those antibodies aren't specific enough to know the difference. So we have these antibodies that are going around in the body, and they start to attack other things, other tissues, and things that are completely natural. And that's where we get autoimmune diseases. An autoimmune disease is where your body, for some reason, doesn't recognize a normal tissue as normal anymore. And it starts to make antibodies against it. And a good starting place that they're starting to find is things that have leaked into the blood from the gut that have mimicked normal body tissue. Make sense? So we get this is a good picture of it. Things leaking in the blood. We got helper T cells identifying it, then mature B cells releasing the antibodies against it, which then eventually go on and attack normal tissue because of this decreased activity by the parasympathetic nervous system, keeping that intestinal epithelium alive. I guess that's all I have to say about that. Cool. So next we have the cortisol steal. See the sad man. Keep him in mind. Because low testosterone, erectile dysfunction, amenorrhea, difficulty conceiving is not exactly a fun thing. And you'll end up sitting on your bed with your arms crossed, looking wistfully off into the distance, wondering why. Why is this happening to me? Well, you're probably stressed because cortisol is a steroid hormone, and all steroid hormones have one big thing in common. They all derive from dietary cholesterol. Cholesterol is the beginning of all steroid hormones. They all share the same structure. If you look at this picture, they all look kind of the same. Estradiol, which is estrogen, and testosterone really aren't that different. They're just all kind of variation on the same shape. So what happens is you have an excess cortisol release. And we call it the cortisol steal because that cortisol is like, okay, in order to stay alive, you need to keep making me and nothing else. So the cortisol system, that cortisol pathway right here, so you see cholesterol is up here in the top right corner, and then it has options. It can go down to this pathway to make aldosterone, which aldosterone is responsible for creating secondary sex characteristics during puberty. It can make the glucocorticoids like cortisol, or it can make the sex steroids like estrogen and testosterone. But if we have chronic stress, the pathway that converts cholesterol to cortisol is the only one that's going to happen. By only one, I mean it's going to be primarily happening. Okay? When that happens, you have a decrease in aldosterone, you have a decrease in estrogen, you have a decrease in testosterone, and those things are obviously necessary for a lot of very vital functions. And a lot of men, especially, are going to start having problems with low testosterone, low T. We see all the commercials on TV about people having low T, and it's a huge problem. And that's a pathway that is directly affected by the cortisol production system. Okay? Amenorrhea, if you don't have estrogen in your system, you can't build up a functional layer in your uterus that's necessary to support life. So your body's going to try to make a functional layer in your uterus that can have an egg implant on it. But if there's not enough estrogen, it's not going to be able to get thick enough so that the egg can actually implant, and you're going to constantly, that's not amenorrhea, that's when you don't have, wrong word, difficulty conceiving, I'm on to the next one already, difficulty conceiving, that's when the egg never implants, you're going to have trouble having a child. There's other reasons that cause that, obviously. There's very serious reasons, there's legitimate reasons, but stress has a big impact on your ability to have a child. Also, amenorrhea in especially young girls, people who are stressed, but there's lots of cases of girls losing their period over stress. They just don't have it. And there's some studies down there that you can read over that. Cool? So I made this slide because after talking about this, we've covered each one of it. There's actually, like, stress, it has horrible effects on your blood pressure. It has horrible effects on your immune system as a suppressant. There's just like a long list of things that this exact same pathway can affect. And this is all the things that we talked about today. It didn't seem like that much, but these are all the things that we listed. And I think that's kind of an incredible testament to say how important the nervous system can be when regulating all the biomechanical, biological, biophysiological pathways and the neurological and all the pathways that we learn about in each individual classes. But it all connects back to like one big theme, that the body works as a unit. So if you start to look at the body kind of in this way, these are the lists of things that you guys can come up with by connecting the dots. You have to become a diagnostician. When people walk into your clinic, it's like, it's a mystery. What do they have? And you're not alone. Like, you have a whole world of people willing to help you, other DCs, other MDs. You can reach out, treat it like a case. You don't have to be in this, like, I'm in it alone. I'm only going to use the resources I know and trust. Like, reach out to people. Like, you can figure this stuff out. I didn't come up with any of this. Like, this is all stuff that I learned from the exact same teachers that you guys have. Like, it's part of the knowledge base that we share. So how does chiropractic help? And I would love to get into that, but I thought it would get a little help and it would be a little incentive to come to the next session. But I wanted to add this one picture because there's an estimated 1 to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way, but there's 100 trillion cells in the human body. And they say the body doesn't have the capability to imagine how many stars are in the universe, but the amount of cells in your body, it's a factor of 100, bigger than what you can comprehend. And your brain has as many stars as the galaxy, as many cells as there are stars in the galaxy. There's over 100 billion cells in your brain there's 100 billion cells in your brain, but there's 100 trillion interactions between those cells. There's an estimated 100 trillion dendrites and synapses in your nervous system, which, if we can't imagine 100 billion, 100 trillion is that times another 100 million. Like, it's an unimaginable amount that we can have to learn. So, like, us talking these conversations is just such a tiny tip of the iceberg that we have to work with. That kind of excites me because I know that there's always going to be work to do. There's always going to be ways to study. And the stuff that we learn in every single class is stuff that we can work with. It's stuff that we have to use. It's not just another test. It's not just another day on the job. It's it's another star in the universe. It's another synapse in your brain, because it's just another experience that we have to use in the future. So if that's the only thing you have to impart from today, then that's awesome and I'm excited. But leave here with kind of the excitement of going to your classes and trying to connect the dots and learning from every single thing you hear. Cool? Well, thanks for having me. You guys are great.